Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, partnering with donors from all walks of life to improve southeastern Virginia through grants, scholarships, and leadership initiatives. Learn more at hamptonroadscf.org.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. The Constitution of the United States divides the federal government into three branches. Legislative, it makes the law. Executive, it enforces the law. And judicial, it interprets the law and makes sure that it's consistent with the Constitution. Each branch is designed to check and balance the other so that no branch becomes too powerful. But what happens when one branch openly defies another? Does it cause a constitutional crisis? And what does this mean for everyday Americans? Answers from Dr. Eric Claville and his award-winning Claville report. That's next on Another View, right after this national, regional, and local news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a Salvadorian who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, accused by the Trump administration of being a member of the notorious gang MS-13. In fact, Abrego Garcia fled El Salvador and entered the U.S. illegally because he was a target of a gang in his native country. In 2019, an immigration judge ruled that he was not to be deported back to El Salvador. He lives in Maryland, married with children. The Trump administration admits that it was a mistake to deport him, but has openly defied court orders to return him back to this country, including orders from the Supreme Court. So why is this happening? And what is the connection to Black and Brown communities in the United States? Here to make sense of it all is Dr. Eric Claville, political and legal analyst and creator of the award-winning Claville Report. Hey, Eric, how are you?
I'm doing well, Barbara. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So yesterday, Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, from my home state of Maryland, went to El Salvador, hoping to be able to see Abrego Garcia, and was not granted permission, could not get in, and everybody's saying basically he's stuck.
Right.
Have we experienced this before?
Barbara, this is one case that I think is going to push Congress and everyone around the table to really determine if we have a constitutional crisis. And I say that not lightly, because of what the administration has done. And you go back to the checks and balances of all branches and so forth. And the Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, said, hey, bring this individual back. You did wrong. Even the administration itself admitted that they made an error. However, they said that they're not responsible for bringing him back. Now,
and El Salvador has also said we ain't sending them back.
Right, and he also labeled him a terrorist as well. Now, we'll unpack all of that in just a moment. But to answer your question, have we seen this before? The answer is we have not. I mean, everyone remember years ago Elian Gonzalez, right? Yeah. Right? How we went and got him. Everyone remembers even how in the Haitian president that was under attack when the Civil War came, he received safe haven in the United States during the president's administration during that time period. I think it was Clinton during that time period. We've seen in history where there have been conflicts or there have been errors by the United States, but we've corrected those. There was a check and balance between the courts, even during the detainment of Japanese citizens during the time of World War II. We even saw that, not kicked out of the country, not exported, but contained within the United States itself. So with that being the case, we have not seen this before on this particular level. Now, what have we not seen before? We've not seen the executive branch of the United States tell the highest court of the land in the judicial branch, so what? And that's literally what they have done.
So we kick around this term constitutional crisis.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly does that mean?
So constitutional crisis basically means that in the event that there is a breakdown of the adherence or obedience to the laws of our land as outlined through our Constitution, then we have a crisis on our hands.
And so at what point, because it isn't defying the ruling of the court a breakdown, so at what point does it become so heavy that it just collapses?
Well, I think the point where it becomes so heavy is that once each branch that's opposing the other branch says, hey, you got to do this, and they just simply refuse to do it, I think and there is no enforcement or penalty for them not doing it, right? I think that's the point where the constitutional crisis happens. Because here's, this is kind of like made for movies type situation, right? So you've got this individual, you gave the synopsis, but you had this individual that's scooped up, right?
He was coming home from shopping.
Exactly. Literally scooped up off the street.
Yeah, off the street.
With no due process. He's by Homeland Security. He's hooded, right? Put on a plane and sent back to his native country, which he hasn't seen since he was 16 years old, right? Now, of course, through the court process, we all know that he is a he is a citizen. He's married an American citizen. Mm-hmm. They have a child together. He's working. Has never been involved with the law, on the wrong side of the law since he's been here. Never. No, as a matter of fact, 90% of individuals that they deported have not been involved with the law. No criminal record whatsoever, right? Individuals who are working, basically living day to day like everybody else. With that, still, the individual was taken over and put into a very notorious type prison system, El Salvador. El Salvador is known for their prison system not being
it's called CCOT, I think.
Yeah, CCOT. Yes,
CECOT, right?
CET. So, what happens is that now you have an individual who has been admitted to be there by mistake, right? But then they say, well, it's not our responsibility. So then you bring the president of El Salvador here, Oval Office, a scripted scene. He's given the point. So I'm not responsible for bringing him here either. I don't want to smuggle, quote unquote, a terrorist, quote unquote, back to the United States, which if you're putting a person that has been detained unlawfully in an error on an American plane that the highest court of the land said should be here, it's not smuggling. All right.
Exactly.
Nor is he a terrorist because he's been deemed by the courts not to be one and admitted to not have been one. Now, here's where and of course, the press secretary says, well, this is in the Department of Justice hands. And then the Department of Justice Attorney General says, well, we'll facilitate it if the president of El Salvador releases him. Then the president of El Salvador says, well, I'm not going to release him because I don't know where to find him. And if I did, I'm not going to smuggle him. Right.
Smuggle him back to the United States.
So you have this play on words. You have this passing the buck. And it's kind of like the hot potato. Everybody's in the same circle, by the way. Same circle on that particular side. And they're just passing the hot potato. Just passing it. To where in a circle, it never ends. So at some point, the court has to say, look, whoever flew the plane, whoever gave the order, you're responsible. If this person's not back by this time, then you're going to jail.
And that needs to come from the Supreme Court or any court.
No, what comes from
the federal court,
right.
Meaning. Yes.
So usually, what the Supreme Court did, the Supreme Court gave the order down to the lower court that issued the original order and said that you have to adhere to that order.
Right.
So as I know, there was a supporting decision by the liberal side of the court, drafted by Justice Sotomayor, joined by Justice Keegan and also Ketanji Brown Jackson, that talked about how crucial this is. It's not just about Mr. Garcia. It's not about him. It's about him in this case,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just not about him. It's about the lawful U.S. citizens that could also find themselves in the situation.
Well, then when you hear President Trump say, I kind of like this, and I'd love to send American citizens to El Salvador.
Sure.
And then when you think about who is the largest population, what is the largest population that is incarcerated in our country right now?
Right. African Americans.
Absolutely.
So when again, and this broad definition of who is a terrorist and who's not. So, this is the example of the sheep and the wolf, right? Usually on the outer circle, you have, the sheep, and then the sheep and on the inside said, well, it's not us. Yeah, we don't have to worry about it. But then the wolf devours the other ring of sheep. And then the sheep on the middle says, well, it's not us. Pretty soon, there's not going to be any more sheep to devour. It's going to be those that said,
in the middle, it's not us.
It's not us. So, where this becomes very problematic is that Mr. Garcia stands as the quote unquote.
He's the symbol now of what the larger issue is.
Absolutely.
But Eric, what if the Trump administration is going to ignore the law and the ruling, then what recourse does the court have to make them do it? Or do they have a recourse?
So to answer that question, I want to first advise what the theory behind the presidential powers are based upon the presidential advisor, Stephen Miller, and his comments that he made on Fox News. Basically what he stated was that the court order that was provided does not basically apply to the president when he's making these decisions. So therefore they can ignore it.
The court order that said that he
has to bring it back for facilitating
to bring it back. Okay.
Secondly, in the case of foreign affairs, right? So they kind of put it around foreign affairs. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, also said that the court has no power to legislate for international relations or foreign affairs on behalf of the presidential office.
So basically their perspective is, or they're trying to present it as the court trying to conduct foreign affairs,
right?
As opposed to the executive branch.
Exactly.
Okay.
But of course that argument failed. I mean that's a stretch. I mean it has. Yeah, I mean that has. First of all, it makes no sense. Secondly, it has no legal grounds, and in practice, that's never been done before. So it's this theory that they're creating about presidential powers that they actually created, that they're operating under, to say that that doesn't matter. Matter of fact, Stephen Miller said that they never said he was deported in error. He said a saboteur out of the he said an ICE official. A saboteur out of the DOGE, it's those exact words, made that statement, not us, right? So, again, if you're not loyal under this particular administration, if you're not loyal to whatever's being said or done and not towing the line, you're ostracized. You're deemed just like Jerome Powell. He's like, hey, lower interest rates. Jerome Powell's like, I've been kind of doing this for my career. This doesn't make sense. We're looking at monetary policy across the board. And because of your actions, we're kind of protecting the U.S., so that we won't go into a major crash. But again, because whether it be Jerome Powell, whether it be the Supreme Court, whether it be whomever it is that is operating within the law, right? Then you're not looked up, and against policy, presidential policy and powers, you're looked upon as this, as Stephen Miller said, a saboteur.
So what is the recourse? Any?
So to your point, the recourse is that Congress really has to act. Congress got to have to step up. And they're being very, very, and when I say Congress, I mean the Republican-controlled Congress. Let's make sure that people understand that the minority party in Congress, which are the Democrats, they don't really have that much power. There are things you could do legislatively, some legislative maneuvering. You can do this and do that and stop things in committee. And of course, Cory Booker gave a long speech, to it was grandstanding, but it was a legislative tool you could use to stop a proceeding and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's the ruling majority of Congress that is responsible for the major checks and balances. The court interprets, and of course, the court can also issue an arrest order as well. However, it's up to the branch in which the arrest order is given to execute the actual arrest, right? So if you have a Department of Justice, which, the U.S. Marshals fall under that, the secret, you have Secret Service, you have all these law enforcement arms that fall under, that particular branch, and that branch stops you. So now you have to ask yourself, who has the power to override that, right? So again, without enforcement, the power of enforcement to act upon an order that's been given, that's where it's a true constitutional crisis.
Eric, how bad does it have to get before Congress would make a move?
I mean, I think it's bad now, to be very honest with you. I think somebody has to have that conversation and say, listen, enough is enough, facilitate this, and, we can't do this without due process. Because keep in mind, not just Mr. Garcia, but
all the other people that were taken.
All the other people that were taken. Remember, they were deported without due process, right? There's another issue, I mentioned to you earlier, where the Department of Justice and Homeland Security are monitoring online comments for individuals that they believe are promoting speech that is in protest as relates to the
Israeli Gaza war,
right? The Israel-Gaza war. So if you're deemed to be anti-Semitic, then there are revoking visas from individuals on university campuses that are lawfully protesting. This is a freedom of speech issue, again, a constitutional issue. But then your visa's being revoked, and you also are being deported. So now there's online monitoring. This was reported last week. I got the article last week and reviewed it. I shared it with you. It's been 1,000 students so far. We've had 7 students at HBCUs in Louisiana that were affected by this as well. So again, you're talking online monitoring of your comments, right? To be deemed a threat or maybe a homegrown terrorist. Now keep in mind, when you look at a balancing act, right? You have homegrown terrorists, that you have increase of domestic terrorism and hate groups that rose during the election of Barack Obama. Exponential amount. Mostly white Americans, white males, and so forth and so on. You also had, J6, where individuals unlawfully raided the Capitol and killed, an officer, and some others were killed as well, right, trying to attack Congress. But all of those individuals were provided presidential pardons, right? So the question now becomes, what is the interpretation of what is a terrorist and what is the domestic terrorist? I mean, individuals in J6 were in those groups that are identified by the Department of Homeland Security during the time of the Obama administration. Those are domestic terrorist groups, and they actually activated, and actually did something. Those individuals that went to the Capitol in Michigan to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Governor Whitmer, those are domestic terrorists, right? They were armed individuals, right? So when you think about who you're interpreting to be a terrorist and taking extreme action against them in order to remove their rights in the country, that's also becomes an issue that also becomes a constitutional issue when you talk about freedom of speech. Now, you can say what you want, but when you activate on those words, that's when it becomes an issue.
757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about what's happening in our country in terms of our political situation that is going on now with the Trump administration. 757-440-2665, 1-800-940 410-220-2240. There's so much.
It is.
There is so much.
You mentioned there's so much, right? I was talking with a friend of mine from overseas, and we were just catching up on some things, and he mentioned, how are you guys doing over there, with your 4-year experiment, and he mentioned, of course, our democracy, has, we elect a new president every 4 years. Mm-hmm. In other countries, it's not like that, especially countries where there's authoritarian type dictatorship, or elections where they are already predetermined, like over in Russia and so forth. But and of course we talked about certain things, and I say, person there's a lot of trepidation around cuts to funding and things of that nature. And he made a statement, and it stuck with me because this is how the world is looking at it. He said, but Eric, that's democracy. This is what the people wanted. This is what they voted for. And, I stopped for a second, and I'm like, no, I don't think they wanted. He said, no. He said, that's who they wanted. So you have to allow the process to play out, because this is who the majority of the people in America. And he said the people, because majority rules, 50+1 is majority, right? So those individuals are responsible for what is happening as well.
What do you think the ultimate end game is? Oh,
well, we know what the ultimate end game is.
Well, right? other than him staying in office forever.
Well, and that's, there now, very quickly, there's no constitutional provision for that. However, we see that this administration, by their own actions, are not interested in what doesn't fit their views and ideas of what should happen. And that's very important, even if it's the Constitution. And keep in mind that when you have a majority rule in a country, and the majority rule tends to find that their majority rule is depleting or being diluted, they change the rules. Yeah. I mean, that's the name of the game. Change the rules in order to fit your narrative. We've talked about this on this show. I've talked about it on several shows that I've done, my shows, and also at various town halls that I've moderated. Project 2025 is going to tell you exactly what the end goal is. I mean, we've been talking about this a year before the election. We did. And the interesting thing about it, and again, you can still go to the website. It's still up. It's project2025.com or .org. But you can go there, and it tells you exactly what this is. You have, led by the Heritage Foundation, along with about 100 other conservative organizations around the country. They drafted this plan that if they got the opportunity to get back in office, this is what they were institute. It's a 180-day plan in order to, number one, shrink the federal government, give rights back to the states. Part of that also was through reshape the judiciary with individuals, judges,
that would agree with the executive branch,
which was actually done during the first Trump administration and all of the appointments. And then after that, changed the personnel law, right, to where now you have personnel who are in office that will be loyal to the policies of the executive branch, by making the executive branch the most powerful branch in government. So that's really that's in it in a nutshell. But if you think about the personnel branch, now this is very important. We have all these mass layoffs that are happening, which, by the way, we're going to see the impact of that very soon. By the end of the summer, we're going to see individuals who were six-figure families that are going bankrupt, that are they can't sell their property because, where they're gonna
go.
Right.
They can't.
Right. And if they sell it, I mean, the buyers are few. Right. And far in between, unless you have a corporate body that purchases.
And if you're unemployed, how are you going to buy another one?
Yeah, exactly.
Or rent another one, for that matter.
And not just that, but even the one thing we talked about that I've heard at the town halls that we were moderating is the decline in support for food supply for food banks and so forth, where now when we talk about that impact, that's going to trickle down. But going back to the personnel, and we can get to another question, just give me 30 seconds here. When there are removing the civil service protections from various positions, there's about 4,000 positions that the president gets to appoint, right? Now, he doesn't appoint like all of them, like I want this person. There are recommendations that come from persons in Congress and advisors and so forth. But those 4,000 individuals within the government control roughly 10 million other positions through contractors, direct federal employees, and the like. Those individuals control about $75 trillion through the federal government, through contracts, and then the like, right? So now when you start talking about who controls total control, if you can control the personnel, you can control the workers. And if you can control the workers, you can control the budget that emanates from the federal government. So, I mean, listen, from a planning standpoint, it's a great plan, right?
But the impact of what that means to everyday citizens, that's the piece that
absolutely devastating.
They decided not to overlook, apparently, because quite frankly, for a lot of people, it won't affect them, but for the majority, it will.
Yeah.
Is that
for that small group?
That small group of people,
right? Because that's what I mean. They're in a controlling minority,
right? They're the ones who are in control.
But for the all American citizens, and even our reputation overseas, right? It's a huge impact.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about power in the executive branch of our government with political and legal analyst Dr. Eric Claville, creator of the award-winning Claville Report. 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Terry joins us from Williamsburg. Hi, Terry. You're on the air.
Hi. I just want to say a couple of things. I appreciate your show, and I appreciate this episode especially. Dr. Claville has done an awesome job of explaining exactly where we are in this country at this time.
Thank you.
My question for you is, as a 65-year-old woman, what can I do?
Now, and you know what? We were going to get to that, so I'm glad you asked that question, Terry. Thanks so much for the call. Eric, what can we do?
Barbara, I've been fortunate enough to moderate state and federal town halls on behalf of our elected officials in the Hampton Roads area.
And I'm going to talk more in detail about those, but and let's answer Terry's question first.
And with that question that the caller is asking has been the
core of every one that you've done.
Absolutely. And really the answer that's been given has not really been a very powerful answer, right? Because at the end of the day, when the party is in the minority, there's not a lot you can explain it earlier. But still, the people have power of the ballot, power to put representatives in office to make changes for you. Now, of course, people want to know, what can I do now? Now, protest is always a way, right? Making sure the majority that's in power, which is the Republican Party, making them be accountable to constituents, especially in your district and in your state, to say, hey, we don't like this. You need to speak up and do something, or we're going to put somebody in office that will. From that standpoint, those are the things that you can do on a individual level. The other part of it is legal challenges. Now, what's happening now is that you can support legal challenges either financially, or you can support legal challenges by being an advocate for them, putting them out on social media, showing up to the court cases when they're heard at the Supreme Court or the federal court, organizing. And organizing becomes very important during this time period. But I'm here to tell you, legal delays are going to run out, right? And this is closing out the answer to this question. It may be more doom and gloom than anything. The legal delays are going to run out. What we've seen that the courts have done, because an executive orders, the president has the power to do what he does, unless Congress reins it in. And that's the caveat. Congress can rein in those powers, all right? Unless Congress does that, those actions will be lawful no matter how negatively impactful they are. So case in point, what just happened in the court, the Supreme Court stayed the order of the lower federal court that told the Trump administration that they had to
facilitate the return.
Well, not just him, but also the rehire of temporary federal workers.
Ah, that's right.
Right?
Yes.
So basically by staying that order of the lower court, what it allows the Trump administration to do is to allow the administrative time delays to run. And then eventually when it runs out, you'll get your letter or email to say, which individuals have gotten, this is what it says. Your services are no longer needed, period. One word, and then you're done, right? So at the end of the day, midterm elections are coming up next year. You got to vote. You can vote in this election as well in the state, right? So you got this election in November. You got the election next year in November to turn Congress. The second thing you can do, you can organize protests. Lawful protests are still lawful, right? You can still do those and be visible because that type of pressure, when elected officials see that, that's a sign that they have to do something and act. And also hold the majority that's in Congress, Republicans, accountable to make the changes that you want to make.
I've heard, and just in conversation with a lot of people as I'm going about out and about in this area, particularly a lot of African Americans saying, you know what, in terms of physical marching, being out there in public and so forth, not doing it this time because we would be the first on the front line in terms of being attacked and so forth. The other thing I keep hearing is, it's too much. Every time I turn around, there's something else. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to hear it. Yeah. I'm disconnecting. What is the danger for any American, but particularly African Americans, to disengage at this particular junction?
Yeah. Barbara, that's a great question. And, as African Americans, we've been protesting from day one.
Exactly.
And fighting for equitable rights.
Right.
Okay. Equitable rights. This is well documented. This isn't CRT or indoctrination.
No, this is fact.
This is fact, right? So you can see that. And there's fatigue that comes with that. There's a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of pressures that, we hold as Black people that we don't talk about because of historical reasons why. We don't have treatment for it because, going and talking to a psychiatrist, is just not really part of what we're
getting better at it, but it's not widespread.
Right. And then, of course, you didn't have access to it either. So you had to do it, you had to handle it the way that you had to handle it. And a lot of persons are, unfortunately, handling it by giving up. Suicide rates are up in our community. Drug addiction rates are up in our community. Alcoholism are up in our community. And it's all because of this pressure, right? However, with that being the case, we have to engage in, the protests and the registering to vote. It has to ramp up starting. I believe if it doesn't happen this summer, we're going to see some issues, right? Because you're about 180 days in, about 6 months in, to this new administration. And if you don't push back on what's happening in 6 months, because usually 18 months is usually when the any administration has the most power, then you're behind the 8 ball and things would have been implemented, right?
Because once they get implemented, then it's really hard to get it get it changed out.
It's hard to change out. We see some of the changes from the U.S. Postal Service that happened during the first Trump administration that are still enacted, and postal workers are suffering as well because of that. But back to what we have to do, we got to engage, but we have to ensure that the organizations, our traditional organizations that have engaged on our behalf and organized these things, are educating our community about why we should do so. And not just us, but other organizations. They've got to educate their constituents as to why they're doing what they're doing, right? Because if you don't educate as to why, because people say, why do I vote? And we talked about that before. A lot of people just stay home because they're like, well, it's not going to make
a difference. But you see now very clearly how it and why it makes a difference.
But Barbara, what's happening now? Really, like the people, like Main Street, they're really not feeling what we're talking right now. Yeah. What we're talking about, they're not feeling that. But I'm telling you, what's going to happen is, stuff rolls downhill, right? And it's going to hit them because it's going to gain speed. And it's like, where did this come from? Well, first it happened to Mr. Garcia, and it happened to the others that were with him. Now it's happening to you, right? Mm-hmm. You're deemed a terrorist now because of what you're posting online, right? So online posting. And keep in mind, within the administration, you have the shadow government of the individual that controls that data because you're giving it to them in social media of X, formerly known as Twitter, and other social media giants such as Facebook and Meta.
You and I were talking about the history, our history of this country, because we're getting ready to celebrate the 250 next year in 26, and whether or not something like this has happened in the past. And I had the privilege of interviewing David Brooks last week with the Virginia Humanities Celebration. And he talked about various times in our country where presidents have tried to take control, and our democracy has always worked. But you brought up a good point. We didn't have the technology back then that we have now. And is that a major focus of, I guess, why this seems to be happening so rapidly and so intensely, because we have this ability to push it out to everybody immediately?
Yeah, I believe so, Barbara. Because of technology and what's happening, there are a lot of things that are taking place that happen at the speed of light. Mm-hmm. We look at the tariffs and how the stock markets worldwide were reacting within 24 hours of each other, because we're all connected by technology. Mm-hmm. We're all connected by computers, all connected by artificial intelligence. The dangers of artificial intelligence is that it's artificial education, right? Because what you see, you're being educated by, and that's what you believe, and that's not always the case. So we have a society now that we're locked to our phone, our electronic devices. Yeah. Now, of course, us that have been...
And then the terrorists were taken off.
Exactly. Right, terrorists were taken off of that, but you got to do a separate show on the terrorists. That is just, just for anybody. That's as anybody that studies economics, that's just insane. But Barbara, I think several factors. The technology part, our society we are adjusted to technology and trusting it, right? So when you trust technology and technology is used against you, and you don't know how to react from that becomes an issue. But the third part, and this is the most important, and you also have a foreign actor that's in the White House as well, which we have never seen before. But really, I think the most important part is that we have a chief executive officer of our country that's not really concerned about democracy. It's concerned about himself and is willing to work with foreign actors that don't mean the United States any good. It happened in 2015, 16 with Russia. It's still happening now. And it's someone who is running roughshod over our process of government. Government, people say it's slow, but it's deliberate for a reason, because we have the balance of the society's well-being in our hands. So it has to be deliberate, but it also has to be fair and equitable. And that's what the Constitution does, even with its amendments. It creates a fair and equitable, deliberate and legislative deliberate process in order to ensure that that we remain a land of laws. That's what separates us. We're a land of laws. Heck, that's what separates us from animals. This is not the law of the jungle. This is not the law of the wild. This is not the law of individuals that don't have a conscience. But this is a land of laws. And once you have an individual who has the power to ignore the law and do what they want to do without reasonable checks and balance, then that's a problem.
That's an issue. 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Daryl joins us from Newport News. Hi, Daryl. You're in the air.
always enjoy the show, but I wish y'all were more objective. You can name any president, Obama and Chelsea Manning, sentenced to 35 years in prison, right? Chelsea Manning, Bellamy, he cut him out after 7. Biden pardons his son, does not going to pardon him. He pardons him. You can find executive orders, presidential, however you want to describe it. They've all done it, and all you guys talk about is Trump. I mean, y'all supposed to be, let's be objective. Brittany Griner is traded for the Merchant of Death, and we leave a Marine over in Russia. Executive orders, decisions. I mean, you guys are talking about one thing. I'm being a little broad here, but every president, you can come up with objectionable things they did, and y'all aren't talking about that.
Okay, I'm going to talk about that now. Daryl, thanks so much for the call. We appreciate it. Eric?
Sure. Daryl, thanks for the inquiry, but I do take exception with the focus and the premise around it. Through executive orders, each president, as he stated, have taken and made decisions on behalf of the country in order to effectuate, working relationships with them, right? We all have individuals in our countries who are, bad actors from other sides. But we utilize those individuals through what's called soft power negotiations in order to effectuate, good working relationships. It happens. You have, in the Bush administration, you have Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in order to effectuate oil to our country. But then we invade Saudi Arabia. Not Saudi Arabia, I'm sorry, Saddam Hussein. We have Saudi Arabia that has a human rights record that is atrocious. But the president, we've always had good work relationships with Saudi Arabia and kind of ignored it from all administrations, even with the Saudi business conference that was hosted in Miami last month, which was attended by our current president and a lot of wealthy people that Daryl and others would never, ever be able to meet or be invited to that room to be at, because there are things that are happening behind the scenes to effectuate a balanced society and work relationships for the good of society consumption, but more specifically for the good of the pockets of the controlling class. What we've never had, and this is what we're talking about, what we've never had in this country is what we're seeing now. And I think an objective individual, if you take a look at what's happening, we've had no president that defied, a court order. Even Nixon, you had Barry Goldwater that walked in and said, "You have no support. It's time to resign." And he resigned for the good of the nation.
And he said that.
Right.
Yeah.
But this administration is not for the good of the nation. It's for the good of that individual.
Let's see. Are we going to Richard in Norfolk? Hi, Richard. You're on the air.
Hi there. Time and time again, we hear the Democrats in elected offices say, "We have no power. We're not in the majority." That didn't stop Republicans at all. And the fourth leg of government is the press, the media. And there is no progressive network nationwide. There is AM hate radio and Fox News that have broadcast for the last 20 plus years how the Republicans can do this, can do this, can do this. So the Democrats not being in power are not relying on the media as efficiently as the Republicans have when they're not in power.
Got you, Richard. I understand your point. Thanks so much for the call. You want to respond to that?
Yeah.
So he's basically saying using that the Republicans used Fox Media, AM radio, Rush Limbaugh, people like that to
push hate speech.
To push hate speech, right? and to push an ideology that people embraced, so that it was kind of a part of the plan.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah. So there are stations that you listen to. Matter of fact, like the main stations or Sunday morning shows are more balanced, and people consider them more liberal than anything. but they are more balanced. The Face the Nation, Sunday morning
Meet the Press,
those shows. Even
PBS
the
NewsHour,
NPR, even The Hill. Now, when you look at NPR, persons consider that to be more liberal than the Fox News, right? So you do have those stations that are competing. But I think what the caller is mentioning is what you just talked about. Who are the Rush Limbaughs, right? Who are those individuals? But that type of media, that's just hate speech. That's pushing a divisive ideology.
But is that an opportunity to mold so that, because clearly this administration has a strong following.
Absolutely.
And that there are people there who believe it. They don't care what they do because, every time something changes, they change right with it. They kind of stay in that realm.
Well, Barbara, I was talking with someone, a colleague this week, and I told him we talked about the influence of the Republicans, and some of the things that we heard at town halls were like, we want the Democrats to be as mean or as forceful as the Republicans, right? We want to fight. And, one of those things that I noticed, with Republicans, even going back to the Southern strategy, the lie of white supremacy is a doctrine that is inbred in our country, like the sand on the beach. Mm-hmm. It is there, right? You can build over it, but that's the foundation of it. And persons say, well, no, it's no white supremacy. If you look at the history of our laws, look at the history of our Constitution itself, look at the history of African Americans, Native Americans, and others, and even white Europeans that came here as immigrants before they were able to be accepted into American white society, the Italians and others, you'll find that white supremacy is a part of that doctrine, right? So this is historical. You can open up any book and find it. Open up a book.
I mean, think about how many immigrant families came here and changed their name,
right,
so that it would be more American, which translates into.
I have individuals that talk to me that said we weren't allowed to speak our language because we didn't want to seem that we weren't white enough, right? So they lost their cultural language because of that, to assimilate in. I say that because it's easy to create fear based on a lie. Person will accept fear based upon a lie and what they are perceived to lose, as opposed to the truth of what they could actually gain
from it. I want to try to get one more call.
Yeah,
we only got about 6 minutes left. Anita joins us from Seaford. Hi, Anita. You're on the air.
Oh, hi. I wanted to find out a couple of things. Where is there some information other than on the internet that people on the peninsula can find out where there are rallies and where they can get together with other people? Because there are a lot of people that don't, believe it or not, don't use the internet, but we want to participate. Now, there's a big rally down at the Capitol in Richmond on Saturday at Capitol Square, but it's a matter of being able to get down there. Are there laws on the peninsula that say people can't go like to a shopping center or on a corner with a sign or something? We're just kind of lost that you don't hear anything on the local news that, there's going to be a group together here, there. What do we do?
Okay, we'll answer that for you.
Sure.
Thanks so much for the call, Anita.
Well, that's a very good question. The local library is still a great place where you see a lot of postings. People still post there. You can, by any city ordinance, especially in Hampton Roads, be on any sidewalk and hold a sign in protest.
As long as you're not on private property.
So you can't do shopping centers, right? But any public property, you can and you're not hindering traffic and putting anyone in danger. So you can, peacefully protest. And that's, again, when we talk about rights and constitutional crisis, our First Amendment set us apart from everyone else. Listen, you can agree whatever side you want to agree upon, but do not break the law and break the foundation of our law. Once you do that, then everything just falls into an abyss. So for all of the listeners, all the callers that called in, that believe that, what this administration is being unfairly targeted, that is not the case. What we're looking at is what's being reported in the news and what is actually happening and out of the mouths of the administration, and comparing that against the law of the land and history. And history tells us that this is unprecedented. What the Trump administration should do: obey the court order, bring Mr. Garcia back, do not run roughshod over due process of law, so individuals can actually have an opportunity to present evidence and hearing as relates to whatever charges or allegations that are brought against them. Once you remove that, it is open season on everyone.
In our last 3 minutes or so that we have left, give another argument or a final argument to why we have to pay attention. I am very concerned that Joe Citizen, regardless of race, creed, color, Joe Citizen is not really paying attention as much as Joe Citizen needs to in order to be able to even react to some of these things that are happening.
I think what we have to do is understand that democracy is worth fighting for. You have to believe that. For individuals,
because people in this country have never, I shouldn't say
this generation,
right, though, they've never lived in anything other than a democracy.
Right.
And so they don't understand what a dictatorship might mean.
Exactly. And to your point, you're exactly right. If you have what's in effect a dictatorship, where individuals are allowed to do whatever they want to do, and you fall into the ruling class to where you fall out of that class of favorite individual, favorite people, then you become a target of that particular group. Fascism, if you look at what happened in Nazi Germany, it just didn't happen immediately.
Right.
But it happened little by little, targeting individuals, and this time Jewish individuals living in Germany, but taking away this right, fueling this story. And then all of a sudden, when individuals were put into concentration camps and the atrocities that were committed upon them, it became something that was accepted, not immediately.
Yeah.
But because you saw it happen over time, the eroding away of rights and protections for those that we consider the less than, or those that we consider on the lower levels of society, are just as important for those that are on top. Because once those rights are eroded for them,
back to that sheep analogy you started with,
your rights are next.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we have to fight for all individuals.
Dr. Eric Claville, always a pleasure to sit and chat with you.
Thank you
we
so
will
much.
be having you coming back periodically throughout this whole thing, because I know we got more on the horizon. And thank you, audience, for spending time with us today on Another View. Now, you can listen to this show or any of our programs online at whro.org/anotherview, on Spotify, or wherever you go for your podcast listening pleasure. Next week on Another View, Dr. Keith Newby and Another View on Health. And, Keith will be coming up with something really good, I know, because I've told him to. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. And by the way, happy birthday, Lisa Godley. Her birthday was yesterday. Jordan Christie is our audio engineer, and Dr. Barry Graham answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. I know it can seem overwhelming at times, but please find a trusted news source and pay attention to what's happening on both the local and national level. Information is power. Let's get together again next Thursday at noon for Another View.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, carrying out your charitable wishes forever, whether it's helping shelter animals, feeding the homeless, enhancing the arts, or supporting students. Learn more at leaveabequest.org.